Alrighty, folks, welcome back. It's good to see everybody again. So no new news other than that over the next few days I'll be sending each of you a copy of your first exam with my comments inserted into the margins. It takes time. I appreciate your patience. Obviously, I try to do them in the order that I received them. That way the people that got them in first will get them back first, but it still could be into the weekend before you get yours, or maybe even first of the week. But in any case, it'll happen. And hopefully the additional time spent putting comments in the margins, if I have things I need to say, will help you know what you did well and what you can improve on. And, if you have questions, you can always email me or come see me about that. Also, the latest discussion board is out there. There was some sort of glitch on my end. I didn't get one of the settings right, and so it failed to deploy. So my bad on that one. But it's out there now. It's on Chapter 5, which we're going to start talking about today. We'll do what we can, see how it goes. But in any case, by all means, post on that and reply to your group mates before next Tuesday, if you haven't already done something, so that I can look at what you're saying and have some sense of what people want to talk about or what would be fun for discussion in class. We've got next week, and then the following week is spring break. So my hope is that between now and the end of next week, I'll have some sort of general paper guidelines rubric for you so that you can be thinking about that. It may seem a little early, but it's not. I mean, we're halfway through, I guess, effectively. So for those who want to get a jump start on it, you'll have that, and hopefully some paper topic ideas as well. I might end up putting some stuff on reserve. We'll wait and see how it goes, but I'm not as happy with some of the selections in the anthology as I thought I might be, and I know of other articles that would make for potentially better paper topics, so I may end up doing that. If so, I'll let you know. And of course, if you have thoughts, questions, interests of your own, things that have piqued your curiosity while we've been going through stuff that you want to write about or that you're thinking about for a topic, then come see me and we can talk about it and maybe come up with an idea. Questions from you guys before we do a little bit more epistemology? All righty, very good. So last time we wrapped up Chapter 4, right, talking about moderate foundationalism. And so just to kind of take stock in where we've been, right, we've looked at one sort of traditional answer to the question of what justification amounts to. And that answer is that it comes down to having evidence, right? That can be spelled out in different ways, whether it's having good reasons, having certain sensations and perceptions, right? Having an argument available. All of these are different ways of thinking about evidence in terms of the way, say, Feldman's thinking about it, right? And then we spent a fair amount of time looking at the traditional approaches to developing that idea, namely classical foundationalism, the modern coherence theory, and then ultimately moderate foundationalism. That was a lot. That's a big, long chapter, but hopefully you got something out of that. If you have questions about any of that stuff, I don't pretend that we've said all there is to say about it, so now's a good time to ask if you do have follow-up thoughts or questions about what's going on in Chapter 4. If not, then let's think some about Chapter 5. So Chapter 5 is a kind of alternative approach to evidentialism. As Rich points out early on in there, no sensible epistemologist is going to deny that evidence is a big part of the story for what makes for rational or justified belief, right? But since, I'd say, probably the mid-'60s, right, of the 20th century, a number of epistemologists working in this sort of Anglo-American analytic tradition started feeling like, look, there's got to be some sort of alternative to just the evidentialist approach. Maybe we need to broaden our perspective a little bit and think about other ways in which a belief could be legitimated or credentialed from the epistemic point of view. I trace history of epistemology is its own area, and I don't claim to be a professional historian of the area, but in my own sort of version of the history, I think of a lot of this is dating back to what was happening with Quine's paper in 1969, Epistemology Naturalized. And we'll read that paper and talk about it near the end of the semester when we talk about naturalism. So around that time, and Goldman was working during that time, and a handful of other people that picked up on these ideas that, well, hey, maybe traditional epistemology has been too concerned with the logic of the concept, with analyzing the concept of knowledge or analyzing the concept of epistemic justification, where by analyzing I mean providing a set of logically necessary and sufficient conditions, right? And that's kind of what we've been doing up to this point with JTB plus Gettier, right? And it's no coincidence, I suspect, that some of that same thinking about trying to make progress in epistemology coincided with Gettier's paper from '63. So the '60s were, it turns out in retrospect, a really pretty productive time and set the course for a lot of where epistemology is now. At the time, it was kind of radical what these folks were saying, but now, again, it's hard to have a sense of all of this. The field changes and it's dynamic, but I'd say it might be split, maybe not quite split, between the sort of internalist, is what I'm going to refer to them as, people that side with Chapter 4, if you will, and externalist, people that are more sympathetic to what we're going to be getting into in Chapter 5. Obviously, the desire to come up with a fix for the Gettier problem for a fourth condition. And that does look like in some cases that's going to need to be something that ties the fact in the world to the person's justification, and that sounds like an external connection, like a causal connection. So all of that's kind of in the background and sort of building up to what's happening in Chapter 5. So some terminology. Feldman doesn't use this terminology. He could have. I mean, he may use it in certain places later on. But he talks about non-evidentialist theories, right, of knowledge and justification. And I'm just going to introduce some terminology because it may be relevant in articles that you end up looking at for your final paper. And it's also terminology that is now sort of in force within the field. So I think of internalism as roughly the view that whatever the justification conferring properties are, whatever it is that turns a true belief into knowledge, barring Gettier, right, the justification component at least, that those properties are somehow internal to the agent's perspective. There's been a lot of work done on this, a lot of people trying to say exactly like internal how. And there are, as you can imagine, lots of different ways of trying to flush that out and say exactly what it amounts to. But obviously when you think about having evidence, possessing reasons, right, having certain sensations and perceptions, being aware of certain introspective states that are present to you, self-reflective awareness, higher order cognitive states that you can become aware of, right, upon reflection. All of that's very much internal to the agent's cognitive perspective, right? I think of that as internalism in epistemology. There's actually a paper, if people find this topic interesting, not surprisingly, by Earl Connie and Rich Feldman. They write a lot of their stuff together. They have a paper defending internalism against externalism, and then Alvin Goldman has a paper responding. They're all friends, where he tries to argue against internalism. So if you like that kind of back and forth, that would be paired papers like that where there's a debate can often make for a good paper topic for you because it's kind of ready-made and set up for you. So that's, again, I don't expect this to be crystal clear in my sort of account of internalism, but hopefully you get the idea. Right? An alternative to that is what's come to be known as externalism in epistemology. Now, again, these words internalism and externalism, they're terms of art, right? I mean, we have to make use of the language that we've got, and if you throw this language around in other areas of philosophy, don't assume it's going to mean the same thing. So there's externalism in philosophy of language, which is a completely different thing. For example, semantic externalism. But here, what I'm thinking of as externalism could mean a couple of different things. The easiest way to do it is just think of it as the denial of internalism, right? In other words, that whatever the properties are about a belief that make for justification or for warrant, they need not be things that are cognitively accessible to the agent. Now, again, what difference does it make? Well, I mean, if you think about the pitch I've used in the past for understanding what the third condition is supposed to be, the justification condition, the way I've sort of tried to sell it to you was, well, it's what you would say back to someone if they ask you how you know or why do you think that. It's your reason for thinking that something's true, in effect, right? And reasons, evidence, experiences, these are things that, although we're fallible often with respect to them, they're at least things that are they're the right sorts of things to be what would fill in that blank, what would be the third condition. So it seems, right? So there's kind of two camps within this externalist approach. One group says we're just going to get rid of the third condition. We don't need justification at all, right? A different group says, no, we need the third condition, but we're going to explain the third condition or explicate it or analyze it in such a way that it's not going to look much like the traditional accounts of the third condition. Those two approaches correspond roughly to the first two and the second two that Feldman talks about in Chapter 5. So Goldman's early causal theory and Nozick's tracking theory, they're both approaches that jettison the third condition. They say, you don't need justification. We're just going to do true belief and some other thing that's supposed to solve our problems. It's going to explain why certain beliefs are rational or not, and it's also going to hopefully get around the Gettier problem. All right? When you get to Goldman's later view, his reliabilism and Plantinga's proper functionalism, Plantinga's his own different kind of thing, and we'll talk about that hopefully next week before the break. But both of those accounts are supposed to be sort of neo-justification accounts. In other words, they think, yeah, you got to have that third condition on knowledge. We have to have the justification condition, but our explanation of what it is, our definition of it, if you will, it's going to be so different from the old having reasons, having evidence, sensations, perceptions, other justified beliefs, and so on. It's not going to look much like that. And all of these accounts qualify as externalistic accounts, as I'm thinking about them, right? So here I've kind of got it set out for you. So one idea is external, like maybe the core concept of externalism nowadays, because all this stuff's in flux, it's moving around. I think nowadays when people say they're externalist, what they mean is usually something like, well, I like reliabilism. And that's the short answer. I like something like Goldman's reliabilism, or I like Plantinga's proper functionalism. But certainly there's this earlier idea that you just don't even need justification at all, and just get rid of that altogether. So let me just stop for a second and see if people have questions, thoughts, comments on that much. There could be a lot. Yeah. That you don't need it at all? Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm with you. You're preaching to the choir, as they say here, because I'm on the, I can, I guess, be a little bit forthright here and put some of my cards on the table. I'm an internalist, but if you were to try to write a paper defending externalism, you wouldn't get a bad grade just because of that. If you got a bad grade, it'd be for other reasons having to do with the quality of the paper, not because you didn't share my point of view. I'm open-minded about these things, and I can say from having met a lot of these folks and talked with them, spent some time with them, that they're fun, smart epistemologists to engage with. I mean, they've given this a lot of thought, and I take their views seriously. But at the end of the day, experts on these things can disagree, as we saw last time, and there's quite a bit of disagreement. So I'm with you, Derek, in thinking that the idea of just jettisoning justification altogether seems kind of crazy. But keep in mind, those were typically the earlier versions, right? Like the stuff that was happening. Well, Nozick's tracking theory was a little bit later, but certainly the early causal theory in the 60s and 70s, and then the tracking theory. Both of those are more radical departures from the sort of hardcore internalism, justification as reasons, evidence, definitely. Now the softer version, or the sort of the newfangled versions of externalism, like reliabilism and proper functionalism, they're closer to the old traditional thing, because they do say, well, but you might think, well, they're just kind of changing the topic. I mean, isn't it semantics at a certain point? Are you going to call it justification? Plantinga calls it warrant, and the way he thinks about warrant really isn't the same thing as the traditional notion of epistemic justification. And the reason why, in short, is because the traditional concept, third condition, is just that. It's the third condition. It's not supposed to solve the Gettier problem. But Plantinga's concept of warrant, even though sometimes he talks about it as if it's justification, it's also supposed to get around the Gettier problem. So some of this may just be people with a lot at stake in their own views trying to defend their turf and jockeying for position to get a label on their view that's more congenial or whatever. I think that's not usually what's going on, but there may be some case to be made for a little bit of that. Yeah, Corey, you look like you had a question.
Yeah, I must have missed it. So when I was reading the C prime version of the causal theory, the one where it's like the fact that P is causally connected in an appropriate way.
Yeah.
I must have missed something, because it seems to me that if you that is a little bit of justification. That is because you
the appropriate way part.
Yeah. Is
a fudge for justification.
Yeah.
Well, I don't want to steal our own thunder because we got the lecture still to get through, but he says, Feldman kind of suggests, right, that certain ways of trying to respond to some of the objections to that cleaned up version of the causal theory, yeah, you could do it, but it looks like you're just going to be reintroducing the old concept of justification, which Goldman was very adamant at the time he didn't want to do. Part of what it was this is going to be a groundbreaking, revolutionary break with the past. We're going to think about knowledge now, not in terms of reasons and evidence, but we're going to think about knowledge in terms of true belief, along with whatever the relevant processes are, in this case a causal process that ties the fact in the world to the agent's reasons for believing it. So yeah, I think you're right. It does, and we'll see it when we get there. It seems like if you try to fix some of the problems with the causal theory, maybe the only sensible way to do it is to basically slip back in something that looks a lot like traditional old justification. Goldman wouldn't have liked that at the time. Now the newer versions of his view, process reliabilism, they're intended to actually be it's a competing concept of epistemic justification, right? And I guess again, it's not supposed to be a turf battle. Internalists and externalists both think that they're doing epistemology. We're both interested in knowledge. We both want to be able to respond to skeptical challenges. We both want to figure out how to improve in our ability to get knowledge in the world. All this is stuff both sides care about, right? But the externalist and the internalist disagree over what the proper analysis of the third condition is. I don't know if that's helping or not, a little bit. Hopefully some of it will get clearer as we get a little further along. But yeah, so again, if some of this is murky, then you can only demand so much precision from the subject, right? As Aristotle says. So here we've got internalistic properties, externalistic properties, just to kind of give you some sense of what we're talking about. I've mentioned the internalistic ones, right? So what are the properties of a belief in virtue of which it enjoys whatever degree of epistemic justification? Well, being a reason for believing, being evidence, remembering, perceiving, being appeared to, it's seeming to the agent that such and such is the case. So a whole range of mental episodes, experiences, right, as well as the evidence that you've got available. That comprises your evidence. What about the externalistic properties? What would those be? Well, here's a incomplete list of things. Being true. So this is important. I think it's often kind of just sort of blown by or missed. Truth is an external feature, right? I mean, that's not something, we're assuming this whole picture here, you don't have, perfect, immediate, transparent access to whether or not a proposition is true. Unless you're God, if you're an omniscient being, right? But for ordinary agents like us, I mean, the whole reason we're seeking evidence and considering reasons and arguments and so on is because our access to the truth is less than perfect, right? So being true is an external feature. The probability associated with a belief, so its probability, that's going to be, again, an external feature of the belief. Its causal process that you use to arrive at it, so it's etiology, as they often say, how you came by the belief, either the causal processes that sustained it or originated it or all of that, right? Being reliably produced, given some conception of what reliability is, that's going to be, again, external. It's not something that the agent can just introspect and arrive at an answer on. Neurophysiological, microphysical processes, the functional properties associated with a given belief, all of these things are going to be properties of which the agent's generally unaware, right? You don't have any direct access to those sorts of things. And again, by saying direct access, assuming a kind of access version of internalism here, and there's other versions, I don't mean to suggest that the agent has infallible access on the internalistic perspective. I admit that we don't, right? So I'm open. So, seeming to remember is different than actually remembering, and seeming to see a cup on the table is different than actually seeing a cup on the table, right? Nevertheless, when we talked about the basic sources of knowledge, right, in the very beginning, we granted that most of these are fallible, but that's what we've got to work with. Right? So better that than nothing at all. So questions about that much of it, the externalistic stuff. So here are the four views that we're going to talk about, and there's hybrids and variations on all these things. Yeah, Anthony.
Just a background. I guess would externalistic imply that something outside of us is like acting on the way we think about that something? That's kind of
Yeah.
I couldn't really work through.
Yeah. No. Let me say this, and then you say something back, and we'll see if we get synchronized here. If something like that were what made for a belief's being justified, or what turned a true belief into knowledge, and that thing, whatever it is we're sort of vaguely gesturing at, is something that the agent is potentially completely unaware of, then yeah. I mean, again, it's hard to know what exactly that would be. Suppose that the feature, the putative feature, is something like, you're correctly instantiating some program, that your brain's running some sort of particular program, and that the program's being correctly executed or instantiated. That's something you have no awareness of. But if it turns out that that's the target property, if that's the thing that makes a belief justified when it's justified, and it's potentially something, or actually is something that you're unaware of, then that's a kind of externalism. Does that help any?
A little.
Are you thinking like if it's something like aliens or God or something that's influencing the beliefs?
Make it simple-ish in my head. So
Yeah.
I guess like a cup is on the table.
And there are a lot of things we can say about my cup on the table belief, right? I mean, all kinds. So that belief has a lot of different properties. If you start thinking about it that way, maybe it's a little easier. It has the property of being a belief of mine right now. It's a belief on a Thursday afternoon. It's a belief that's occurring in this room. It's not my favorite belief. It's a belief about cups. It's a belief that I think conforms to my total evidence right now. That's starting to sound like it's getting a little warmer, right? It's a belief that I have access to because I know that I have that belief, right? I think it's a belief whose content I actually know as well, because although I might be fallible with respect to the contents of my own beliefs, I think in this case I'm not. I don't think I'm on Twin Earth. I don't think I'm in the Matrix. So, I mean, there's a lot of different properties that any given belief of yours is going to have at any particular time. What this internalism-externalism debate is all about is which of the various tons of different properties, which are the ones that make for justification, or which epistemize, the word that gets used sometimes, true belief, in the case that you don't want to talk about justification. All right, yeah. No, I mean, it's good. I mean, I'm happy to take it on. I mean, it's fun stuff to think about. It's just hard to formulate the thought sometimes. Yeah. So we've got the early causal theories, people like Alvin Goldman and Brian Skirms. We've got the tracking theories by Bob Nozick. He's the main developer of that. Goldman later jettisoned the causal theory and went through several different iterations of that and came up with reliabilism, which is sort of his baby. And then the latest thing is Alvin Goldman's proper functionalism. He wrote 3 volumes defending, kind of working out this idea of his proper functionalist account of warrant, as he calls it, instead of justification. So let's take a look at the very first one here, the causal theory. That may be enough for today. We'll see. And hopefully you've had a chance to read it. I know it's a lot harder if you haven't, to kind of keep up with what's going on, because this stuff's not easy. So here's the basic idea behind the causal theory. Let's modify the traditional analysis, right, by getting rid of the justification condition and inserting instead a causal condition, right? It's basically requiring that the fact in the world be the cause of the agent's belief, right? A kind of causal connection. I've got it stated for you here a little bit more formally. So we can say that S knows that P, if and only if, we've still got the truth condition, P is true, right? We've still got the belief condition, right? But now instead of the justification condition, we put in S's belief that P is caused by the fact that P. All right? Now, we don't have to take the time to do it, but as they say, as an exercise to the reader, I'll leave it to the reader. It's not a bad thing just to kind of gauge your own understanding of these different proposals, to go back maybe to some of the early, I mean, Feldman uses examples throughout in each of the discussions of the different theories, but to go back, as he sometimes does, and reflect on earlier examples and see how they either would work, try to work through them yourself. So you could go back to some of the earlier Gettier examples and see, okay, let's try putting the causal theory to work and see if it gets the cases right. Then you think about the sheep in the field example, right? That's one of the Gettier cases. Remember how that worked? So you're in fake barn country and you're riding around out there and you see something that looks like a sheep off in the distance and you form the belief, let's just suppose, I'm modifying the example, oh, that's a sheep. And it turns out that you believe it and it's true, and on the old view you're justified in believing it, but it's actually not a sheep that you saw, but off in the field, just coincidentally, out of view, behind that fake barn, is a sheep, right? So it looks like you get a justified true belief, but it's not knowledge, a la a Gettier case, right? And that was chapter 3. Now, what do we do with the causal theory? Well, you can apply the theory and see how it would work, right? So the idea is that that's supposed to be a case where the person has a justified true belief, but they don't know that it's a sheep in the field. What would the causal theory say? Anybody want to walk us through it? Does it get the right result there?
It has some kind of connection to knowing that.
Yeah, so I mean, according to the causal approach, right, for the person to know that there's a sheep in the field, it has to be true. They have to believe it. And the fact that there's a sheep in the field has to be the cause of the person's belief. The belief has to be causally connected to the fact in the world in the appropriate way. But in the Gettier cases, right, it looked like the belief isn't connected in the right way, because the thing that caused the person to think that there's a sheep is really just a wolf in sheep's clothing or a fake sheep or whatever, right? Two-dimensional cutout. Whereas the real one didn't play any causal role. Wasn't causally connected, right? So it looks like the causal theory gives the right result. That's good. Gets it right in that particular case. But no amount of cases where you get it right is enough to show what we're after, which is, are there going to be any counterexamples? Are there going to be cases where you can satisfy the causal theory and yet you don't know, right? That would show that the causal theory isn't sufficient for knowing. Or going the other direction, are there going to be cases where you have knowledge, but you don't satisfy the causal condition, right? So we want to ask whether or not having a causal connection is necessary for knowing or sufficient for knowing, right? If it turns out that it's neither one nor the other, either one would be enough. But if you don't have to have the causal connection in either direction in every single case, then the theory's false, right? So I guess the thing is just, as a kind of throwing it out there for you guys, as you're reading through these different theoretical accounts, try to walk yourself through. And Feldman does some of this work. He's pretty good about that in the chapter. So here's the initial statement of the theory, and as I said, the good news is that causal theory gets a lot of cases right? A lot of perceptual cases. So, like the best case scenario for the early causal theory, are going to be perceptual knowledge, right? I mean, the old hackneyed cup on the table example. It's true. I believe that it's true, and the fact of the cups being on the table is the cause of my belief. Presumably, it's there's a certain complicated process which, as philosophers, we don't have to try to really worry about, right? But photons are bouncing off of this object, whatever it turns out to be, and I'm perceiving it, right? And information's traveling back through my optic nerve to the back part of my brain and visual cortex, and all this processing's occurring, and again, a lot of heavy computation, but in the end, it all issues in a perceptual experience as of seeming to see a cup on the table. Yeah.
So one of the things I was thinking about is mainly the one with the fireplace, like the fire and the smoke. What would they say? Like,
yeah.
Someone who thinks the CT's good be about is correlation causation. Because a lot of things seem to be there's like a correlation, but that doesn't necessarily imply causation.
Yeah. I mean, correlation doesn't imply causation. That's right.
Yes.
So this actually requires that there be a causal connection. As you're worried that, help me out here, that how can we ever be sure that it's a causal connection and not just some sort of fluky correlation?
Yeah.
Okay. Question. Way to go. Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, I mean, well, so there's a lot of different things to say here. I mean, there's a difference clearly between correlations and causation, and the one isn't the other. Philosophers are kind of divided, as you can imagine, over causation. That's a really hard topic. To this day, I don't know that there's a standard view on this. I mean, I think one thing you could try to do is you could try to use correlations as the basis for forming a belief that there's some causal connection between things. But as far as is there a universally agreed upon account of causation among philosophers who work in that area? No, not at all. There are Humean accounts which are not, to me, very satisfying, right? The idea of just constant conjunction and the cause being prior to the effect, and then an expectation in us that regularity will hold up. But that's Hume, so it's going to be real bare bones and empiricist in its leanings. You'd like to think that there's more to causation than just that, right? Just one thing happening and then another thing happening, us observing that regularity and then an expectation being formed. I mean, that doesn't seem much like genuine causation to a lot of us. One thing you could do is you could try to say, well, look, let's use correlations as the basis for getting justified in our causal beliefs. So you note over time that A is positively correlated with B, right, within some population, P or whatever. You note that regularity a lot, right? And then you rule out, so as part of your sort of doing your due diligence, you rule out that the correlational factors aren't reversed, and you rule out that there's not a common cause that explains the correlation, and then you try to rule out that the correlation isn't just accidental. And if all of that is true and you're aware of it, then you may be on your way to making the case that the one is causing the other. But, you know, again, I'm kind of taking what you said and maybe going in a different direction with it. But if your worry is, how do we ever know that anything really causes anything, given that there could be a lot of correlational stuff going on that doesn't rise to the level of genuine causation? I don't know. I mean, and I'm not a skeptic about causation. It's just I know enough about that particular area to know that there's not going to be. It's an ongoing thing.
Yeah, I was just like this.
Some people use counterfactual accounts of causation. They'll say, you know, that's a popular approach to trying to understand it, right? That X causes Y if and only if, you know, Y wouldn't have occurred but for X or something like that. But those are all, they have problems. I don't know if this is getting to what your real worry is, though.
I mean, to answer the question, it just seems like that seems like some of the counterexamples I didn't like, because there are, like, I can think of like a chemistry experiment being like, yes, if I put these things together, O2 is created, and that is like the direct causation, but something big like global warming.
Yeah, where it's multifactorial.
It's quite a lot of correlation versus like this is the direct causation.
Right.
So that's, where I was
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you're onto something here, and I mean to take it seriously. I mean, and one thing that Goldman, if you go back and you look at the original paper, I think it's 67, Causal Theory of Knowing. If you go back and look at the original paper, I mean, Goldman, he's not trying to provide a theory of causation. He's sort of, like a lot of these things, you can only take on so many different projects in a single paper, right? And philosophy is really bad, especially about this, because you might have to make use of other concepts to try to do the theoretical work you want to do, and inevitably the other concepts are going to be really, philosophically dense or thick concepts themselves. And so, we have to somebody who is a skeptic about causation, some Humean about causation or something maybe, then the causal theory might be just dead in the water, because how do we don't even have a viable, plausible account of causation. I wasn't going to take Goldman to task for that, but I do agree with you that it'd be nice in a full. If you're really going to try to defend this thing, you'd also want to be able to say something about what do you mean by causes or by a cause. Yeah, no, I think that's great. And I mean, and this may seem like, again, just kind of picking nits or whatever, but certainly as someone who's interested in modern physics, right, we know that causation gets kind of weird at these really small scales. And so, it's something to really be concerned about, for sure. So here's the bad news, right, is it look like there are counterexamples to this initial statement. This isn't the final statement of it. So this is an example here that's kind of inspired by the one that I think Rich uses here. So let me just read you before we get to it, though, a statement here. This is over on 82, about 2/3 of the way up, after we've got sort of the initial version of the theory before we look at the counterexample to it that inspires Goldman's sort of change or twist. Feldman says, Goldman concludes the essay in which he defended the theory by saying, and this is a quote from the paper, from Goldman, it flies in the face of a well-established tradition in epistemology, the view that epistemological questions are questions of logic or justification, not causal or genetic questions. So Goldman means to be rejecting that sort of tradition. That was part of what was supposed to be novel about a lot of this. So what's the problem with the initial version of the theory that requires the appropriateness of the connection modification? Well, looks like you can come up with deviant causal chains, right, where you've got, let's suppose, just kind of like building a Gettier example, not quite, but it's similar sort of strategically, where you've got the truth and you've got the belief and you've got a deviant causal connection, but intuitively the person doesn't know. So the example that we get is over on 83, the blow to the head. Somebody want to read that one for us, just to get it out there? Yeah, thanks, sir. Appreciate it.
Gerald was falling down the steps and hit his head. He blew his head, scrambled his brain in such a way that he formed a variety of wild beliefs. Among other things, he believes that eating lettuce causes obesity, that the Chicago Cubs will win the World Series, and that he was just falling down the steps. In fact, he has no recollection of the sensation of having fallen. This belief, like each of the other two just mentioned, is simply a direct result of the blow to the head.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate it. Rich always has to slip in some sort of baseball reference, right? You can tell he's a baseball and basketball fan. So with the Cubs. So and then my version here is a similar kind of thing, right? Where so we can imagine these kind of so-called deviant causal chains, right? Causal connections that are non-standard. And so somebody, hits their head and they form a bunch of crazy beliefs as a result of that. Or in my case here, you've got somebody who's got a space-occupying lesion that causes them to have these wacky. Plantinga, we'll see later next week when we do the proper functionalism. Plantinga loves these really exotic kinds of hypothetical cases, and then they're fun to think about. Sometimes I wish they weren't so exotic because your intuitions might be a little stronger, right? If they, you got people being belted by gamma rays and weird stuff going on. But in any case, we want to be able to rule out that Gerald's belief, right, that he's fallen and hit his head, is a case of knowledge, right, or that he's just fallen down the steps because it's not formed in the right way. Let's suppose he doesn't know that. It's formed in this kind of deviant way. So how do we fix that? Well, so here's the upgrade, the revised version, right? And you might have thought when you were reading this, this is just kind of a fudge. You've got to tell us more about what do you mean by appropriate. And Goldman does in the original paper. And if somebody gets interested in this and you want to explore it deeper, that's fair game. You could take a look at the original paper. It's complicated and involved. So this is C star, the version that he wants to defend, right? S knows P if and only if the fact that P is causally connected in an appropriate way with S's believing that P. And the force of the in an appropriate way clause, right, is to rule out these kinds of deviant cases. And he gives some examples, right, of what counts as an appropriate sort of connection. He says, this is at the bottom of 83. Goldman gives the following examples of appropriate causal connections between facts and beliefs: perception, memory, proper reconstructions of causal chains, right? So obviously perception and memory, though not infallible, we want to get those in there, right? So when perception's working properly, when memory's working properly, you can come to know facts on the basis of those perceptual processes. If it's not already clear, Goldman really likes perception. So when he's and it is important. Perceptual knowledge is a big part of what we care about, but it's not the only thing. But then he also adds this stuff about proper reconstructions of causal chains. And if you look back at the original paper, a lot of time is spent in there very tediously trying to show a variety of different ways of properly reconstructing causal chains, and they get kind of complicated. I remember I haven't looked at it recently, but I remember it being like, pretty involved with lots of dashed arrow lines leading from different sets of beliefs to different, trying to make it all work. So the good news, again, is that this can plausibly rule out the deviant causal chains like the blow to the head or my hypochondriac example, right? But as always with these things, looks like it might still be open to counterexamples, showing that even an appropriate causal connection is neither necessary nor sufficient for really having knowledge. Why is that? Well, let's take a look at a couple of the problems that... Let me stop first, though, before we go any further. We may want to talk about the missing tree example. Probably should. So over on 84, this is an example of a proper reconstruction of a causal chain, example 5.2. Anybody want to read that one for us, just to kind of get it out there? Yeah, Anthony, thanks.
Smith returns home and sees a lot of sawdust and wood chips on the ground where there used to be a large tree. He recalls that the tree was diseased and that he received a notice stating that the city tree service was going to cut it down. So he infers and thereby comes to know that the tree was cut down.
Yeah. So he didn't actually perceive it being cut down, right? But he knows the tree was cut down. Why is that? Well, he's able to properly reconstruct the causal chain. Goldman's theory accounts for this. This is just from right below that. Fact, by allowing for appropriate connections between the fact and the belief, when the belief results from a proper reconstruction of the causal chain leading from the fact to the belief, Smith's able to reconstruct in a sensible way the causal chain involved and thus has knowledge. In this case, there's a causal chain leading from the cutting down of the tree to the presence of the wood chips and sawdust to the belief that the tree was cut down. Because he can do this, right, because he can reconstruct the causal chain from the tree being cut to his belief, Goldman counts this as a proper reconstruction, right? His theory implies correctly that there's knowledge in this case. So again, if you're somebody who likes the details of these kinds of things and is curious or has doubts or questions about the extent to which you can marshal this idea of properly reconstructing a causal chain to get around various putative counterexamples, you can take a look back at the original paper and some of the secondary literature that developed around it. There's also the smoke, right, coming out of the chimney. So the person knows there's smoke coming out of the chimney, but that fact isn't what's causing it, but rather there's a common cause of the smoke, right, and their belief, namely the fire, right? So you got to get some of those common causes in there as well. But looks like we might still have some problems, right? So Feldman mentions a couple, and you might or might not buy it. So let me put them up here. So the first one here, and he doesn't say a lot about this one. I always thought it's kind of curious that he didn't say more, at least in a footnote somewhere, and I've talked with him about it. But I guess he didn't want to go too far afield. But here's the first one. This comes over, this is at the bottom of 84, right? Knowledge of generalizations. So Smith knows that all men are mortal, but the fact that all men are mortal doesn't appear to be the cause of Smith's belief. Likewise for our knowledge of mathematics and logic and conceptual truths, right? All triangles are trilaterals, all bachelors are unmarried, all red things are colored, 2 + 2 = 4. You may say, well, this is kind of a ho-hum objection to the causal theory. I mean, the proper, the obvious sort of kind of knowledge that Goldman's really interested in accounting for is our knowledge of the external world, perceptual knowledge. So why take him to task on this? And that may be part of why he doesn't make more of this objection. But looks like in these cases, those kinds of facts, at least he says, they're not causes. So these are sort of, again, this is hard stuff to think about, and some of it takes us a little afield into some thorny questions in metaphysics and philosophy of language, perhaps, but certainly I suspect some folks might have read through this pretty quickly and wondered, well, why not? Why can't all men being mortal be a cause of, my belief that all men are mortal? I know that one. And if the causal theory is correct and you're sympathetic to it, then it's true and I believe it, and there just has to be a causal connection of the appropriate sort between my belief and that fact. So is Feldman assuming here that there aren't any facts of that sort, or that facts of that sort aren't causes? Presumably the latter. But if they're not causes, then why aren't they causes? Everybody got any thoughts? Are people getting it?
Could you say that you know that, or you don't even have to, but you have never heard of anybody living past this, like, or there's no one who is immortal? Wouldn't that be like a cause for you to think that everyone is mortal?
Yeah, but I mean, is that just a rewording of all men are mortal, and so it's going to kind of boomerang back around and not be a cause again? I mean, I'm just wondering. I mean, you can see what he says about it, right? The causal theory works best when we restrict our knowledge to specific observable facts in the world, right? The problem is that generalizations do not seem to be causes, right? 2, the proposition that all men are mortal, right, doesn't cause your belief in 2, so there's no causal connection, and thus no appropriate one. So one question might be, well, what the heck's going on with these generalizations, right? How do we get our knowledge of those? Well, in the case of this example, right, all men being mortal, presumably it's an inductive move, right? So every kind of maybe like what you're saying. I mean, we've observed lots and lots of cases of individual people, and they've all turned out to be mortal, right? Based on that, we make the inductive inference that all men are mortal, right? Again, these inductive inferences are just that. They're non-deductive, so they're fallible as well. But, you could pick a different generalization. Right? How is my knowledge that 2 plus 2 equals 4, right? I know that one. We all agree. It's true and I believe it. But is the fact that 2 plus 2 equals 4 the cause of my belief? It doesn't look like facts of that sort are causes, which of course raises the question, well, then what is a cause? What do you mean by a cause? And you might think, well, I mean, those kinds of facts, these are abstracta, right? I mean, these are, as opposed to concrete things, these are not places and times and substances, the right sorts of things of the right ontological category to play the role of causes. And again, there's debate, considerable debate over the nature of, causation and what causes themselves are. But typically, you think about the relata, the things that go into a causal connection, being events. One event causes another event. So the event of my throwing the baseball at the window causes the event of the windows shattering, the glasses shattering, right? The event of the car sliding on the icy road causes the event of the accident. So the relevant things in these causal connections appear to be events there, right? And I guess these generalizations aren't event-like, is the idea. So something to think about. Whether if you don't find this objection compelling, or if you think he's not being fair enough to Goldman's view, or if you just want to explore it, this would be fun to think about. How about the next one, overdetermination? See how this worked. Somebody want to take this? Is a fun one. Poison and heart attack. Somebody want to read that one for us? Yeah, Anthony, thanks.
Andrew knows that Alan is taking fatal dose of poison and has no answer. Enough time has passed so that Andrew knows that Alan is dead. But Alan didn't die from the poison. Instead, so upset at what he had done, he had a fatal heart attack. Andrew's reconstruction of the causal chain is not correct.
Good. Yeah, so people see why this is a problem here, right? So he knows that the person is dead, right? Edgar knows that Alan's dead, but not for the reasons he thinks. Something causally sufficient for Alan's death has taken place, but it's not the actual cause. So it looks like there, the fact that he hasn't properly reconstructed the causal chain doesn't seem to make any difference to the fact that he does know. Right? So looks like in the case there, if this is right, then having an appropriate causal connection doesn't look like it's, or let's go down here. All right, so can a person be appropriately connected to a fact even if they haven't correctly reconstructed the causal chain? If not, then cases of overdetermination show that having an appropriate causal connection isn't necessary for knowledge. All right, so it looks like you can know something despite the fact that you haven't correctly reconstructed the causal chain. Now, Feldman mentions that you could try to fix this by tweaking it, and this is kind of back to one of your earlier points, right? If you introduce the idea of, well, Edgar knows something, has information available, right? Has reason for thinking that something causally sufficient for Alan's death has occurred. But again, that seems, the suggestion there is that that would introduce this notion of having reasons or evidence back into the picture in a way that wouldn't be congenial to Goldman's view. What about the next one here? This is one that I think Corey wasn't liking.
Yeah, it just seems illogical to me. Like, why would he rationally discount that? It was like true, like, you know, case of like.
I'll read the case to us here. This is at the bottom, right, of 85. The Trudy-Judy case. Trudy and Judy are identical twins. Smith sees one and for no good reason forms the belief that he sees Judy. It is true, and it is a case of perception. He reconstructs the causal chain between Judy's presence and the belief properly. He knows about Trudy, but rashly discounts the possibility that she's the one he sees. So it looks like here you satisfy all the conditions, right? But intuitively, he doesn't know. Smith doesn't know which one he's seeing because he's not paying attention to evidence that's available to him, right? So what's your worry here, Corey?
It seems to be trying to strategize to put an argument in the way that it forces it to be wrong, when in that case it shouldn't. Like, you could, this one doesn't really hold up for me because he rashly decides that. Well,
yeah.
I mean, yeah, it doesn't say anything about you can be rash all you want, so that, I guess, proves the point, but still.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I'm trying to know what I want to say back. I mean, if we're just trying to get a counterexample, then it looks like what we'd like to do is like get a case where we've got it's true, that S believes it's true, and the causal connection's there, and it's of the appropriate sort. I guess you could try to quibble over whether this is the appropriate sort of causal connection, given that the person's sort of not paying attention to other things that they're aware that they know, and get out of it that way. I mean, that's kind of what I'm suggesting down here at the bottom, right? I mean, does it really have the implication that Feldman says it does? And then he presents a kind of way, to help the causal theorist out, but that comes at a price, right? It seems like. So what do people think about the causal theory? Good, bad? That people aren't sold on it? It's okay. It's all right. Yeah, Anthony.
I thought it was interesting, a breath of fresh air, I guess,
after all the
eventualism, but
yeah, it's more mechanical feeling.
Yeah.
It's all of these to me have that kind of, and I agree. It can be refreshing and kind of fun to think about, because so much of the foundationalist approach and the coherence theory approaches were really, really leaned heavily on sort of the logic of believing and the evidence for one's belief, right? The reasons one has for believing. Whereas here, it sort of strips it down. And you can see the appeal. I mean, certainly if you're also an epistemologist who thinks that too much of traditional epistemology has been guided by armchair methods, by, this sort of Cartesian thing or quasi-Cartesian model of, well, let's find some beliefs that we can be certain of, or let's find some class of beliefs that have impeccable epistemic credentials from the internal perspective, from our own inside points of view, and then build our knowledge or justify, explain the rest of our knowledge on the basis of that. Yeah, this really does break with that. And this is a big move away because, the folk, and of course, it was intended to be. I mean, if justification is not going to be part of the picture for a theory of knowledge, then where else do you turn? Well, let's look at some of these things in the natural world, right? Causation, causal connections. That's the sort of thing it sounds like scientists could investigate. They could study, right? The causal connections between the various states that a person gets into, the various beliefs that they have, and so on. So, yeah, I think it's a fun one to think about. I agree, if nothing more. Other thoughts, questions? All right, well, I think I'm going to stop with that for today and let this be our Friday before I go on to truth tracking and pick that one up next time. Truth tracking goes pretty quickly, and then hopefully we'll get through reliabilism. May not get to proper functionalism before spring break, but we'll see. Cool. Thanks, folks. I appreciate it.